Welcome to Druva's LinkedIn Live series, In Cloud We Trust. We're glad that you're joining us. I'm Lisa Martin. Today, sitting down with true folks from Druva. We're going to be talking about data privacy in the cloud era. That's a big topic. Drew Daniels joins us, Druva's CISO and CIO. Drew, you're just down the street from me in San Jose, so virtually saying hello.
Howdy, everyone.
And Jung McCann is here as well, Druva's general counsel. Jung, we're jealous. You're snowed in Idaho in this beautiful setting, but we're glad that you're joining us this morning.
Thanks. Nice to be here, Lisa.
So lots to talk about. We're going to be talking about three topics, as we always do during the next 15 to 20 minutes. The continuation of work from home, as we're all feeling, and the impact that that has on keeping customer data safe. We're then going to talk about the role of data protection in strengthening your data privacy. And then the third thing that we're going to talk about is this evolution of data privacy regulations and guidelines in 2021. So let's start with you, Drew. This continuation of work from home. Here we are, socially distant. Drew was saying right before we went live that he joined Druva during the pandemic and has only gotten to meet a handful of people in person. So the impacts of COVID, data portability, decentralization, what are some of the things that you're seeing?
Well, especially around decentralization and kind of that data portability. I mean, if you look back and you think back to a year ago or a little bit more than that, roughly prior to the pandemic, we had a lot of the ability to leverage our coworkers. We're sitting right next to someone. So we don't necessarily have all of the data and all of the necessary access. We can rely on those kind of verbal and in-person communications. But now that we don't, we're having to pull down more data into our devices, and with the kind of the additional expansion of technology, each of us has 1, 2, 5, 10 devices in the home. So we may have personal data on, a laptop, a tablet, a phone, a desktop. There's just so much data out there. So data proliferation is something that's really important to kind of point out and talk about from a data privacy perspective.
And do you think that companies are ahead of the curve in terms of dealing with that? Because we know that we expect that some amount of work from home is going to continue, some percentage, right? And it could be a lot more than it was before. Are companies ready for this?
I mean, clearly companies are not ready for it. This is something that we've all struggled with, even those of us who are a little bit more prepared. I had a conversation a few weeks ago with a CISO at a restaurant chain. And he said, I've been dealing with kind of that data portability and it existing all over the place for a long time. But even he said it changed things dramatically for him and what he focused on and what he was paying attention to. And kind of that data, those data issues, specifically privacy of something that's been continuing to, tick up, and will continue to do so for the foreseeable future, I believe.
And Jen, from the seat of the general counsel, this continuation work from home, we're all jealous. You're beautifully snowed in Idaho. But what are some of the things that you're seeing as technology is becoming more and more capable? And as Drew said, we all have this proliferation of devices. How do you advise, companies to manage this and get a handle on it as it continues for some TBD time period?
I mean, one of the things that we do is I work very closely with Drew and make sure that as people are continuing to work from home, that they're using the right tools and that they are company approved tools so that we know where the data is collected. I think when people are dispersed like they are, and they have been for the last 9 months, people like to use their own tools. And whether it's a communication tool or a storage tool, when we're talking about company data, personal data, customer data, it's really important that we, both the CISO and the GC have visibility into where those tools are being used and which tools are being used. So Drew and I work very closely on that front, as all CISOs and GCs should. The other thing that we look at as people continue to work from home is how to bring them back and how to collect and store and maintain some of the personal health data that we'll be looking to gather as people return. So that includes vaccinations, COVID, symptoms, and everything along.
Temperature. Yeah. Yeah, that's one thing as I've been temperature checked a few places I've been out legally. I don't even think about where's that data going, and it's temperature, and I don't really care so much. But you think about if this is going to be a regular occurrence, especially the status of your vaccination, that's kind of personal information. Although I think I'm going to wear a Band-Aid very proudly when I get my vaccination. So you guys kind of both talked about the alignment of your two roles being really critical here. Recommendations for businesses: make sure that your general counsel and your CIO, CISO are aligned in lockstep. Drew?
Yeah, I mean, it's been great, in the months that I've been at Druva, that Jung and I have a very, very close relationship, and I think that has befitted us to, have these discussions. I can name half a dozen conversations that she and I have had, and with her and her privacy team around data privacy issues, and how do we, excel and do better at what is expected of us as data custodians. I mean, it's absolutely critical, and I think both of us take our roles and responsibilities as custodians of data very, very seriously. We know how important that data is, and we also know how we got here. The breaches that you hear about every day just continue to plague the news and need to be addressed.
Yeah, I wonder if you both could comment on, Jung, you said one of the things is you need to make sure that employees are using authorized tools. And with everything being so challenging right now still, and people having quarantine fatigue and missing out on certain things, how do companies do that? Like, how do you do that? How do you make sure that people aren't using apps like WhatsApp, for example, or things that they shouldn't be using on company networks?
Well, I think one of the things we have to keep on top of, and I think Drew is really good about this, is what tools are installed on various company devices. And then, if you're a user of a particular tool, you might not pay as close attention to the privacy updates that they do to their own policies. WhatsApp just came out recently with a bunch of updates to their privacy policies, and a lot of users are adjusting their settings in response. And so if we use a company tool, it is our responsibility to maintain and make sure that people's settings are done appropriately. And so if it's not a company tool, then it does make it more difficult to track that usage.
Yeah, we've all got to be diligent, sort of that shared responsibility model, if you will. Let's move on to our second topic. Drew, we'll start with you. The role that data protection can play in data privacy and strengthening those policies. As tech evolves, and we're still in this very interesting time, where are most companies right now? You said a minute ago, there's a lot of work to do that companies have to really be on top of this. What's your advice and recommendations for, given this landscape that we're still living in, how companies can really leverage data protection to have very strong, dependable, reliable data privacy policies?
Well, and I could probably write a book about this, so I'll try and make it concise as I can. I think first and foremost, which we've talked about, Lisa, is where are your critical assets? Where is the critical data? What's the most important data that's out there? And do you know where it is? And do you know where it's being used? And I think Jung and I, this is one of the conversations Jung and I had is how do you manage the life cycle, the lifetime of that data, because we all have a preponderance to pull down the data for the use that we have it for today, but no one and companies need to be aware of this because it really impacts the size and scope of breaches. Is no one is really looking at like, okay, I'm done with that data. Now I need to delete it. Now I need to remove it from my systems. That doesn't say that we shouldn't store it long term. We shouldn't do backups. We absolutely should, because that information may be critical, for any number of reasons. But we need to increase the user education about, that data life cycle. When data's usefulness is no longer as relevant, we need to purge that data and move on. Like in anything in information security, by doing that, we are reducing the size of the problem. We are narrowing the focus. So, if we focus on all things at all times, as everyone knows, that's impossible.
Boiling the ocean, definitely impossible.
Exactly.
And Jung, you talked a little bit about, some of the new data types that are going to be collected, like vaccination statuses and temperature checks and things like that. So this whole COVID data hygiene that you and I have talked about before, talk to us about that. As employees return to the office, how can companies leverage data protection to ensure that that new data that comes in at some frequency is secure and protected according to what Drew was saying?
I think that data collection is going to go in 3 phases. I think first, companies need to be transparent. So that means that they are going to be obtaining consent from the employees to collect that data. Then they need to control the access to that data. And then they need to think about how long that data is useful. So as Drew was talking about, one of the guiding principles of any of these privacy regulations is data minimization. So when you don't need it anymore, you've got to purge it. I've heard anywhere from 30 days for purposes of contact tracing to make sure that you've got the ability to do that when you need to. But after 30 days, maybe you can purge it. You don't need to maintain that health data anymore. And one of the other things that Drew was talking about in terms of purging, companies should be looking at their record retention policies as well, because they should be up to date and they should be followed. As you've seen during COVID, the regulators are still very active in enforcement. Kind of the flip side of that is I think companies should be very vigilant about their internal policies as well.
I'd like to add something to that. If you kind of follow, and a couple companies have done research on this. If you follow kind of the, specifically where there's a couple more years there, the evolution of fines in GDPR. Each year it doubles, triples, because the regulators are becoming more comfortable with the regulations and how to assess those companies. So you're going to see, as you're going to see 2 major trends, I think, going forward. One is, the bite that these regulations have are going to continue to hit companies and hit the hit the pocketbook of the companies. But you're also going to see more of this regulation. I've seen that there's been some discussion primarily in the U.S. about taking and federalizing some privacy practices a little bit more than what we have today. And that's really what happened in GDPR, is it became more of a collective thought process on how to protect, citizen data.
And speaking of evolution of things like GDPR, Jung, when we had you on the show back in the summer, we talked about CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act. Well, in the last election, anyone remember the last election? There was more than just the presidential election. We now have CPRA. Talk to us about CPRA, the evolution of that, and to Drew's points from fines and perspectives, what does that mean for businesses?
CPRA is also known colloquially as CCPA 2.0. So it's really an evolution of the existing California privacy regulation. One of the major changes in my mind is that it's created an enforcement agency that is well-funded. My view is whenever an agency is well-funded in terms of enforcement, you can expect active investigative powers as well as penalties and fines. And even during COVID, when CCPA was in place, enforcement started in July 1, 2020. So they did not delay their enforcement authority at that point. And I saw a stat last week about GDPR enforcement increasing almost 40% in 2020. So the regulators are not resting. And I think part of that might be due to the increase in cyber attacks, which is happening as workforces are becoming more dispersed. So
yeah, the breaches aren't changing.
That's right. That's right. So CPRA is a big deal in California. It comes into effect in 2023. It is something that companies are going to need to prep for sooner rather than later. It affects data starting to be collected in 2022. There's no longer a grace period that companies enjoyed under CCPA. So under CCPA, if you were notified of a violation, you had 30-day grace period to fix it. And that has gone away under CPRA. So,
and one thing I'd like to add to that, specifically to Jung's point, as a CISO and CIO, there has been, some early resistance to some of these new regulations because they can be over cumbersome, to implement and manage. But this evolution is not going away. It's going to continue to increase. So instead of waiting until, these things start getting actioned and fines start getting issued, people need to think about, that data portability, think about that data minimization that Jung mentioned, so that when you do have to address these new regulations as they unify and increase, that's going to be less. It's going to be less work. If you wait until, you have to address it, then you're going to run into all kinds of issues.
Right. You talked about, cyber attacks being on the rise. And we talked about that a lot last year on this program and other things with Druva. We talked to customers who'd had to deal with ransomware situations. And one of the things, Drew, that I know that you're big on is being proactive. When it's now not, I talked to a Druva customer in the UK last week. It's not if we get hit by a breach, it's when. How do you advise companies respond to that, getting out ahead of it? Because it's now one of those, like I said, not if, but when.
Yeah. Well, Lisa, for me, that has always kind of been my mantra when I talk to our board, when I talk to the rest of our executive team. I want to make sure that they understand that there is no, not having an incident. There is, it's really when, and to what severity will that issue be, which is why things like, being aware in general of these legislations and laws and regulations and doing things like data minimization become, paramount, because you want to reduce the surface area of the problem so that it is more manageable. One thing I've said to people more and more times is you gotta break it down into bite-sized chunks so that you can actually consume the meal. If you're trying to tackle this whole landscape all at once, you're going to fail. And that's why minimization comes into the issue. That's why, knowing where your critical assets are, knowing where the data is, as we all know, the more and more information about us is being collected. You mentioned, Lisa, early on about kind of the information around temperature checks and in vaccination statuses and things like that. I mean, there's just going to continue to be more dynamics that are added to you as a person, the profile that the digital footprint that exists about you. And the responsibility has to be on everyone. It's not just on the companies, but it has to be on us as individuals to be, appropriate custodians and making sure that the data that companies have about us is accurate and up to date.
Yeah, that's a huge important piece there and some variables there as well. Interesting question, Drew, for you coming in from the audience. Deepak, lead software engineer at WorkApps, asks, to what extent is data secure while it's being moved from one cloud to the other?
I think that's a really, really smart question, really good question. And unfortunately, my answer is going to be a little less than ideal. It depends. And what I want to say about that is something you mentioned that you and I have talked about a couple of times, is that shared responsibility model. These cloud providers can't be the securers of the cloud. All they can do is provide the tools, the capabilities, and the infrastructure for us to be able to action against that and set these things up. So if we aren't doing that, then we're going to run into issues where, I'm on the cloud and I'm in the cloud and moving that data back and forth, but it's still not secure.
I like that answer. It depends, which is always just brings up more food for thought. Deepak, thank you for watching and sharing that question. John, let's wrap it up with you. Some of the things, if I think about the three topics that we talked about today, we talked about this continuation of work from home, data protection, and the role that it can have in data privacy, and the evolution of data privacy and guidelines. Some of the things that I heard resoundingly from both of you were data minimization. You've got to know where your data is, but you've got to educate your people. You've got to make sure that your teams are, wherever they are using authorized apps. Jung, take us out with your recommendations for how the general counsel and the CISO CIO can really become partners in an organization.
I think one of the things that we do for each other, any CISO and any GC, is making sure that we're on top of the privacy regulation developments. I think both of us expect that it's going to evolve in 2021 and over the next couple of years. There is currently no federal privacy law in the US, so it's state by state, which is very difficult to keep track of. Even though conceptually principles may be the same, there's a lot of differences state by state. And I think we need to keep track of the privacy regulations around the world. So there's a lot going to be coming out of the EU post-Schrems, post-Brexit. So we're keeping our eye on that. And then there's also Asia. So there's a lot to keep on track of. And I think that Drew and I both do a good job of keeping each other informed. Takes a village.
It does take a village, and those alignments are key. Well, guys, thank you so much for joining me this morning. This is a topic that we could continue talking about, so probably have to have you back. So I'll say thank you on behalf of the audience. Thanks, Drew. Thanks, Jung. We appreciate your insights and your time.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you for watching Druva's LinkedIn Live series, In Cloud We Trust. We're going to be back in 2 weeks from today with a new topic. We'll see you then. Stay healthy.